Hey everybody, today is Monday, August 14th, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from the Netflix original series Beef, editor Laura Zempel.
I really love character pieces. I love really in-depth, really rich, complex characters, and the show has that in spades. I love that in addition to mixing comedy with drama.
And editor Nat Fuller.
You start to be introduced to these moments where you're like, wow, there's actually more going on here than just kind of like this silly beef. These characters have some baggage that we are starting to see.
Yes, all that and a lot more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, hey there. Here we are again, you and me. Just a couple of hopeless fanatics of all things post-production related, which would make this our favorite season. And no, I don't mean summer, I mean award season, which is underway right now with the Emmys. When are they going to be handing these things out? I do not know. Not in September as they usually do, but sometime in the months after that, probably. Whenever they do, it doesn't matter. That's not important. What is important is recognizing the very talented editors who are up for those Emmys. So that is just what we're going to do, starting right now. Today we're going to talk about the Netflix series Beef. Hopefully you've seen it, for two reasons. One, it's really good, and two, well, it will help you understand what we're talking about. Although, as always, you don't necessarily need to see the show to benefit from what the editors have to say. If you do fall into the I haven't seen it yet camp, well, I can tell you that it starts with a premise which we can all relate to. Well, not me, I'm a very courteous driver. But it starts with two strangers, Danny and Amy, played by Steven Yeun and Ali Wong. The two almost get into a little fender bender in the parking lot of a home improvement store. And like a lot of people would, they trade honks, profanity, the obligatory middle finger. But unlike most people, hopefully, they let this all boil over into a full-on road rage car chase that gets captured on a couple of home surveillance cameras. What follows is a cat-and-mouse game of revenge and one-upsmanship that spirals out of control into situations one could never see coming. Which does help the series serve all the more as a cautionary tale about controlling one's emotions, especially behind the wheel. But of course, the series is so much more than that, exploring both the lives of Danny and Amy and the secrets they keep and the pain they have, and it's also kind of a social commentary on society. What else? That, to me, sounds like the kind of project that an editor could have a lot of fun with. And also one that demands the talents of editors who know how to make the most of complex characters and complex situations. Two of those editors would be Laura Zempel and Nat Fuller. They are nominated for an Emmy for the 10th and final episode of Beef. As for Nat, he is no stranger, and no, I did not intend that to be a pun. He is no stranger to Netflix, having cut his teeth as an assistant and then editor on, of course, Stranger Things. And Laura also has some pretty impressive projects to her credit as well, notably EUPHORIA. So we're going to find out what Nat and Laura brought to the editorial table from their past experiences, as well as a lot of other things, for Beef. But before we do, first a quick shout out to our pals Extreme Music, who so faithfully continue to sponsor this show so that you can continue to hear from the most amazing people working in post-production today. Now, for those of you new to The Rough Cut and wondering just who this Extreme Music is, well, they happen to be your basic A-list talent-driven music production company that creates and licenses music for television, film, advertising, and online media. And when I say A-list talent, I mean names like Hans Zimmer, Quincy Jones, Mark Mothersbaugh, plus a whole bunch of other great artists you know and a few you don't. But either way, they're incredibly talented. So just head on over to extrememusic.com for your next project and dig into their vast catalog of production music from the best of the best. All you got to do is a quick and easy keyword search on things like instruments, genre, speed, vocals, era, mood, composer. They give you backtracks and various links, and with pretty much whatever instrumentation you need. You can even search for music that sounds like a reference track you give to them. Maybe you really want to lean into 90s era pop rock type hits, just like they did on Beef. We'll just send them a track from one of those bands that I probably don't like, and they'll send you back ones like it, if not better. All that power in one simple-to-use website where you can do all the licensing online, or perhaps you get a little help from one of their reps at an office nearest to you. So the next time you need the very best production audio out there, check out extrememusic.com. Okay, time to get on with the show. From the Netflix original series Beef, here are Emmy-nominated editors Laura Zempel and Nat Fuller. I like to avoid that awkward moment.
Yeah.
Speaking of awkward moments, this show, what's so cool about this show is it has such a simple and relatable premise, but then goes places that none of us would ever want to relate to. But I thought we would start with the simple questions, and nothing is more simple than how you got the job. So, Nat, why don't you tell me about how you got this gig?
So this job was brought to me by my wonderful agent, Laura Brokaw, who is also happens to be Laura Zempel's agent. So just the luck of the draw where my agent brought this show to me, and she saw something where it would be interesting to me. And I read the scripts and right away I knew that it was something that I'd like to be part of, especially with the actors involved in Sunny and Jake. And yeah, it was a no-brainer for me to join that one.
Well, I think I see the agent connection here, Laura. How about you?
My agent, Laura Brokaw at Gersh, brought it to me, but she told me that Harry Yeun was attached and that he would be doing the pilot. And I had worked with Harry before on Euphoria, as he worked on season 1 with us. And I loved working with Harry. And so that was a huge draw for me. So I read the scripts and then I talked to Harry about it and, asked him what drew him to it, because he had been in conversations for a long time. He originally was supposed to do the full series, and then the schedule pushed and they needed to bring someone on to take over his episodes. So that was kind of why the scripts came to me. And I just remember talking to Harry about it, and he was like, you would be perfect for this. You should definitely do it. And so he was a big reason that I was drawn to the project, because I love working with him and I love his taste. And then I met with Sunny, and that all went really well. And I loved the scripts. I loved the needle drops that were written into the episodes. I thought that was so fun. And so I was on board right away.
I'm happy to hear that your agent was able to make this happen for you. For each of you, what is it about you that Laura thought this series is going to be perfect for Nat or perfect for Laura?
I think Laura Brokaw knows that I really love character pieces. I love really, really in-depth, really rich, complex characters, and the show has that in spades. And I think she knows that I love that, in addition to mixing comedy with drama. And so I've never asked her, but I assume that's kind of why she put me up for it.
Yeah, I would carbon copy that answer. I think the same thing. I've talked to Laura extensively about like the projects I'm interested in, and I always heavily favor character pieces, character drama, things that have get to explore, the good and the bad of human nature. So I think just having that in mind was something that she recognized. And same answer as some comedy, some drama, things that are not just one type of genre. I like having like laughs, the drama, the comedy, the action. So whether that's something that she recognized in the scripts and thought that would be a good fit, very happy that she recognized that.
So tell me about the interview process. So obviously, your agent thought this is going to be a good thing for you. At some point, you have to interview. What went on in that discussion, and how was the show pitched to you, and how do you kind of pitch yourself in a situation like this?
Oh, that's a tough one. I always just try to go into interviews as sort of a conversation where I want to understand. It's basically just to see if I feel like I read the scripts and the show that I think they're trying to make is the same show the creator is trying to make, just because I know if that's not aligned, I don't think it would be a good fit. So I try to go into every interview very open with sort of trying to discover what story they're trying to tell and seeing if that is also what I got out of the script. It was still in the pandemic. So Sunny and I met over Zoom, and I think at that point, I had only gotten the first 3 scripts. Yeah, I'd only gotten the first 3 scripts. And basically, I just wanted to talk to him about music, because the needle drops that were written in, and then also just this idea of like, Amy really drew me in initially, just this inner struggle where everything seems so perfect on the outside. So we talked a lot about Amy and what she's going through, because Steven's arc is a little more relatable and understandable. So that was it. It was basically just me asking a lot of questions about Amy and, what is wrong with her and why. And then also, of course, I'm trying to get information like, so where's this going to go? What's going to happen with them? And he told me a few things, but at that point, I think they were still revising drafts of the episode. So it was a little vague, but there was enough there that after meeting with Sunny, I was very excited to take the next step.
Yeah, my interview process with Sunny was similar. I approached it as if it were a conversation, and there was a little bit of, he would ask me like, hey, so after I read the scripts, like, what does this remind you of? I think kind of like making sure that our view of what the story was going to align. And the one film that I immediately kind of equated with it was Parasite, which I had recently seen many times and I just loved so much. And I talked to him about why I thought Parasite was kind of a similar story, and with the class dichotomy about like the rich and the poor and like people in different positions, and then also how those two types of worlds can collide. And then he told me very much about how he wanted this to be very Sopranos-esque, which I thought was a little bit surprising, but after he kind of explained it to me, it made a lot of sense. And so I immediately started watching The Sopranos again. And we just kind of talked about different scenes. He mentioned, he asked me if I'd ever been to a Korean church, which I had not. So I actually went and visited one just to kind of get a vibe of what that was like. So yeah, we just talked about like kind of the intricacies of the characters, and I talked to him about how what I like in sort of these types of shows of delving into character work and kind of like getting under the hood and like looking at flawed characters, I think was a thing that I really was very interested in. We talked about, so yeah, very much of a conversation and talking about what shows we like, what movies we like, and what we were interested in bringing to the finished product.
Well, before we move on from the interview process with Sonny, I did read that in pitching the show, he actually had a PowerPoint deck that he used to get across his concepts and his ideas for the show. Did either of you get to see that now infamous PowerPoint deck?
I did not get to see it, but I heard a lot about it. It was timed to music. He had like all of the music timed out with the PowerPoint. That's what I heard.
Have either of you ever experienced anything like that before, talking to a showrunner?
No, I feel like I get pitch decks where I get like a photo book sometimes of just like images or whatnot, but I've never seen a PowerPoint.
As far as collaborating, were you working together? Were you isolated? How was the post-production process for Beef?
It was a little bit of everything. They block shot the episodes, so we were all sort of getting dailies at different times. I believe Harry started first, and then Nat started a week or two maybe after Harry. And then I started a week or two after Nat, and then Jordan Kim, our other editor, started after me. So we were all doing dailies from home. All of the assistants were from home. And in that first part of the process, it's really strange. I find it very strange doing television dailies from home when I haven't met the other editors or seen their cuts, or, you know, if they're gracious enough to share. So I called Nat and introduced myself and was like, "Hey, I'm Laura. I'm cutting the show. How's it going? Tell me everything." And he let me watch a scene or two, which was great. And he had been in conversation with Harry before I started. And so eventually we started doing 45-minute Zooms on Friday just with our post team. So we would all hop on Zoom and get to know each other and just chat, how's the episodes going? What everyone do this weekend? It was a really nice way to bond while we weren't in the office. And then I think before we went into the office, once everyone had been on the show for a while, our post team met up for Korean barbecue, and then we all went and did karaoke afterwards, which was great. Very intimidating way to meet your coworkers for the first time. So that, I feel like that really bonded us. And then once production was done, we moved into offices in Burbank, and we were all working together for a little while, but COVID was starting to surge. And so we decided to keep as few people in the office as possible. So Nat, myself, and Jordan had offices, and Nat and I were pretty much there all the time. Jordan, I think, was in director's cut. And then he was there like as needed. And then he unfortunately had to leave. He had another show coming up. So Nat and I were really in the office most of the time together, but I think that's why he and I really bonded, was because we were kind of the only two on the island. So we'd go into each other's rooms and check in and show each other scenes. And what are you guys doing with this scene? I need help. Can you look at this? Is this good? And just debriefing at the end of the day. It was so nice being in office. I much, much prefer being in office on a show.
Yeah, we were basically neighbors, so we could hear each other's scenes most of the time. So I could kind of hear what was going on over there. And then, yeah, we would definitely check in with each other. And we had many times where we wouldn't know this from Sonny or Jake, but we would just I would watch one of Laura's scenes and be like, oh, like that line means a little something different now that I've seen it. And so I would go back into to my edit, say it was on episode 3. And so it would set it up for episode 4, which was Laura's episode. And we can kind of bounce each other's ideas and kind of have an idea of where we're coming, where we're going to. And we were constantly kind of checking in and making sure that the storyline as a whole was cohesive, even though we were kind of working in separate zones at certain times. There was always a check-in period where we would kind of understand the state of one episode versus the other, so that there was a very nice cohesive through line throughout episodes 1 through 10.
Well, I want to ask you more about that process, but before I forget, so karaoke, what'd you sing?
We sang a lot.
What didn't we sing? I think I tried to do, if I recall correctly, I always like to do a little bit of Roy Orbison, probably butchered that. But we did kind of collectively start to hit our needle drops from the show, which was fun because so we preemptively did, Hoopstank. We did the Incubus song Drive. So yeah, I think we kind of went through and got our 90s vibe and kind of got in the zone there, which was a lot of fun.
Definitely. I was very nervous because I wanted to make a good impression and I didn't know how serious our karaoke group was going to be. So I did Alanis Morissette, You Ought to Know. And I felt like it fit the 90s vibe. But we have an amazing video that I will not be sharing of Harry Yeun singing Hoobastank, The Reason, which is like gold.
We got to talk later. I feel like I have no choice but to jump way ahead and get right to the needle drops since we keep bringing them up. The needle drops are so 90s. Collective Soul, Limp Bizkit, Hoobastank, The Offspring, System of a Down. How did you discover those tracks? And why 90s?
I wish Sunny were here to answer that because it is all 100% Sunny. Every one of those needle drops was written into the script. I think the only one that changed was Hoobastank in the pilot. It was originally supposed to be Smashing Pumpkins, but Tiffany Anders, our music supervisor, sent a batch of alternates, and Jake Schreier, our producing director, this is how Sunny tells the story. Jake Schreier, our producing director, who never smiles, when he heard Hoobastank, he smiled. So it had to be Hoobastank. So it definitely was born from Sunny. And I remember asking, especially because kind of what you're saying, when does this show take place? Why is everyone listening to this? It is a little confusing, and I wanted to understand the rules of the show as I was building the episodes and placing music within my episodes. And I remember talking to Harry about it, and Harry was sort of like, I think we're not sure, like play with it, see what happens. And so it started a little bit looser. And then as we discovered it, because the show definitely takes place in modern day, and Sunny, he grew up with that music. And I think for him now as a showrunner, he is hearkening back to the music that he loved and grew up with. And I think, a lot of showrunners about his age are starting to do the same. And my theory is, I don't know if that's why 90s music is becoming a little more popular in TV shows, is because the creators of these shows grew up with this, and this is what we're hearkening back to, which I find very interesting. But, to Netflix's credit, they loved the needle drops at the end, and they encouraged us to do more. So then, we came up with the gag of Amy's SUV is sort of just stuck on this Sirius XM, like 90s radio. And she's just driving around listening to O-Town and Master P or whatever is in her car later on. And it was just so much fun. It just really opened up this whole other world of comedy. And I think it just gave the show a little bit more of a distinct texture that I think sets it apart.
Yeah, I talked to Sonny a little bit about it as well, and just to kind of get an idea of what it was. And the way he described it was really good. It's like the cringe. He's like, these are songs that you cringe to, but you also secretly enjoy. And so I think that was kind of like he bottled that up very well. It's like, you're like, I love this song, but like nobody should know that I love this song. And so I think he had a lot of fun with that. And then I think also he had the idea that, like, because Amy and Danny are about that age where that was the music that they would be listening to when they were younger. And altogether, it was really fun to listen to them, because those are the songs that I listened to growing up. So when I heard Collective Soul in there, I'm like, yeah, man, I was like Collective Soul. I was like, that's cool. And like, I think we put also like, we tried playing Papa Roach, and we tried playing all these different songs that really kind of brought some memories back for me as well.
Yeah. The designed part of the needle drops at the end of each episode that I didn't think about until Jake explained it to me was they start cringe and laughable. And then as the show becomes more and more serious towards the end of the episodes, the needle drops also get a little more serious, and they progress from sort of this like comic cringe to actually a little more deeper and meaningful. And hopefully that echoes what the characters and what the storylines are building to as well. So it's like very thought through and very, very consciously designed that way.
So getting back to the way the show is shot and edited, I was not expecting you to say like, I only got the first 3 scripts and we were block shooting and we were kind of all over the place. Not having a clear picture of where the show is going towards the end, does that make it more challenging to make sure that as you're progressing through the series, like everything you did beforehand still makes sense?
So when I interviewed, I only got the first 3 scripts. When I got hired, I think I got the first 6 at once. And so I knew enough to get started, which was really nice. And I can't remember how the block shooting started. They were kind of timed where they were shooting the majority of the first episodes, and then they'd add on with some of the later episodes. So by the time they were shooting episode 10, I think that one was just straight episode 10, because it was Sunny, our showrunner, directed that episode. And that's the one episode he directed. The other 2 the other two directors were Hikari and Jake Schreier. So they were cross-boarding a lot. And so with, this idea of not knowing where it's going to go and Netflix releasing all these episodes at once, it's sort of strange to not know. Like I didn't originally, the way the schedule broke out, I was not supposed to shepherd episode 10. I was supposed to do 9, but then some things got shifted around. And so our post-producer called me and was like, hey, are you cool doing the finale? And I was like, well, what happens in it? And he's like, well, I don't know, but it starts with two crows talking. And I was just like, I want to do that episode. Yes. So I think it's just putting trust in the showrunner, and, the scripts were pretty solid. So I had enough to get going, but then it's sort of like what Nat was saying earlier. We were able to watch each other's episodes and we didn't have to lock them all right away, which was really nice. So we were able to go back to previous episodes once we knew where things were going, or if there were inconsistencies, we could adjust for them, which was really, really nice.
For a show like this, knowing when to play up the comedy and knowing when it's too much, knowing when it's getting too dark, that seems like something you have to constantly be discussing with the showrunners and keeping an eye on. How challenging is that for a show like Beef, where it's certainly very funny, but sometimes that comedy comes from a moment like where Danny decides not to kill himself and is trying to put out his hibachis. You got to be kind of delicate with that stuff at times.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that there's a little bit of delicate hand going on there. And I also think that the way it was written and like kind of the slow burn of that type of more dramatic moments lend itself very well to kind of the progressive build where we start to get into a little bit more serious territory. So at first, episode 1 has, I would say, more comedy. Episode 2 is more comedy. And then when you start to get into 3 and 4 and 5, you have these moments such as in episode 3 when Amy is talking to George, and also the moment where Danny is crying in church, where you start to be introduced to these moments where you're like, wow, there's actually more going on here than just kind of like this silly beef. These characters have some baggage that we are starting to see. So I think the way that Sunny and Jake had kind of built those moments in, the audience started to get kind of accustomed to it, and it was built into the experience where you're like, okay, like I'm going to be able to laugh here, but I'm also, you got to be careful, not careful, but you got to be ready for moments like the one in church where you're like, I'm actually feeling something here, and I wasn't quite expecting it. But once that's introduced, you can kind of start having it become more of a upfront as the episodes go on, where you get to episodes 7, 8, 9, where you're like, okay, like I can laugh, but I also am ready for these moments of kind of heavy drama.
You have these two characters, and it's almost impossible not to somehow side with one versus the other, at least at first. And I think the pilot episode, who you introduce first, whose side are you on first, and from whose perspective are you mostly seeing these events play out? Is that something that you thought about? I want the audience to feel one way versus the other, or I have to be careful that they don't?
That's such a good question. I was hoping that the audience would be able to relate to both and like maybe not choose sides, or I don't know. I think it didn't really occur to me. I think I was just so focused on making sure that both of them came across as clearly as possible that I wasn't trying to weight one towards the other. It's funny though, that script, the pilot episode was originally written to be Danny's story all the way through. So you meet Danny, you go with him through the hibachi scene. He finds the receipt in the bag, and then he looks up the license plate number and he has the flashback to Amy's car going in the garage. And then you reveal that it was Ali Wong behind the wheel. And then we follow her whole story linearly. And so that was how it was written. That was how it was originally put together by Harry. And then we wanted to experiment with kind of what you're saying, giving them both equal weight and like seeing if there were parallels that we could draw between the two of them and their journeys as they go through their day after this incident. And so by cross-cutting the episode, we found that it actually gave them both equal weight, because I said earlier, Danny's story is pretty easy to understand. It translates a little bit better, whereas Amy's it's so interior and it's a little more complex. And it was really challenging to make sure that was coming across to the viewer and, making sure that we understand what is wrong with her, because her life does look so perfect in, film and TV or visual mediums. So like, how do you get this across? And so we found that by cross-cutting, Danny at work with Amy at work, Danny with his brother, Amy with her family, like we could see these pressures that were building on both of them, and they actually played off of each other and hopefully drew more sympathy for them as individuals by pairing them together. But in terms of picking favorites, it's fun. I mean, I like a show that people can argue about. So if people want to be like, I'm team Amy, I'm team Danny, that's great. But then my hope would be that whoever side you're on, you shift as the series goes on. So you're engaged and you're like, ooh, Danny went too far, throwing out Paul's college applications. That's not cool. Or, Amy's having an affair with Paul. That's not cool. But like, hopefully by then we've built enough sympathy where all bets are off and we'll follow these characters anywhere because we understand what is eating at them. And that was the heavy lifting that we had to do in the pilot, was like really lay that groundwork so that we understand their choices for the rest of the series.
Balancing these two characters, do you have a process for managing or keeping an eye on how much time you're spending with a character or balancing between the two characters?
I learned something new on every job. Is one of the reasons I love TV, is working with other editors. And Jordan Kim, our editor, I took over episode 8 after he had to go on to another job, and he color coded his dailies by scene. And I was like, this is brilliant. I should start doing this. So in my timeline, I could see how long each scene was visually, but I wasn't smart enough to do that on the pilot. I think I should have, now that I think about it. But on the pilot, I wrote note cards. I had to write note cards for each character. And I Danny's were blue, Amy's were pink, and I put them down on the ground and I would move them around to see like, okay, well, we could go here and then here, but then that's 2 blue cards next to each other. This is 2 pink cards. And something like that was very helpful, especially on an episode like that had more heavy lifting editorially maybe than some of the other episodes.
Well, Nat, you're always busting out a new trick or technique on other editors on a show. Anything you taught or you brought to Beef from your background on Stranger Things and other shows?
Yeah, one of my, we've talked about this one before, Matt, is my favorite bins is probably one of my favorite little tools when we're working in a shared project. And I remember talking to the other editors, kind of like trying to get them on board with that at first. I'm like, favorite bins. So that way we can put the cues that come from our composer, Bobby Krillick, the Hacks and Cloak, we can put them in one place, and then they're accessible from any of the other projects. So that was something that I pushed for at the beginning, as I always do whenever I go into a new project, just because that's how I like to have things done. Like Laura said, we're always learning and kind of teaching each other new tricks. And so that was one that I definitely brought to the table. And yeah, it was very fun just to talk to Harry and to Jordan, who's really, really good with his comps. So we had a lot of learning opportunities throughout the show that we all kind of came out of the end a little bit better editors, I believe.
Well, I kind of skated past this when you were talking about starting remote and then being together. Is there sort of an assimilation process that happens when editors go from being remote at home to now we're together in a post facility?
It's become a little bit more manageable as we've learned to kind of get accustomed to this work from home situation, where we remote into a place that has all the media. So luckily we're not having to like kind of have drives at home. I've heard some stories about that, which I'm very thankful that we didn't have to do that. So once we got into the office, the Nexus that we had been working on lived there. So we were kind of able just to kind of like get right into it. And we had a great post team who was able to kind of manage that for us.
Obviously you collaborated on the finale, but you also each had your individual episodes and did some amazing work on those that I didn't want to just put aside altogether to focus on the finale. The Vegas episode, I thought, was just pretty intense in that there's a lot of action. You have intimate moments in the hotel room, then you have some crazy moments in the casino. There's no real question here, as is often the case with my interviews, sorry. But just your reflections on working on that episode and what you enjoyed about it and any challenges you faced in doing such a big episode.
I love that episode. I'm so glad that's the one you brought up. That one is one of my favorites for sure. There's so many scenes in that episode that I absolutely love. Probably my favorite is Paul and Amy together when they're at the end of the bed and she finally like has someone who's listening to her. And Yeun, who plays Paul, he's so sweet and he just brings this like innocence. Like it just really draws you in. And I love Allie's performance and just watching her listen. Because for me, that's kind of the first time that the road rage takes on something else. It's like the first time when Danny becomes a person to Amy, as Paul's talking about him, is like, he's so tired, he does everything for everyone else. And it's like the first moment the light bulb goes off for her of like, oh, this guy's kind of like me. I do that too. And I love that scene. I think it's kind of like one of the hearts of the show is that Paul is kind of the link between these two characters, Danny and Amy. That was so fun. It was so tender and intimate, especially in a show that's so wild and crazy. And then, Amy on stage is just so much fun. And, we in editorial and everyone, we all know there's magic when Amy and Danny are in scenes together. And so having that big moment where he crashes her conference and then the chase through the hotel room was so much fun to cut. And you can just tell Steven's having the best time running through the hotel and laughing, and then the arrest and like the Offspring needle drop with her little wagging finger is so ridiculous and so fun. And it's such a fun, contained, it's almost a bottle episode just because everybody's in the same place at the same time. And yeah, I love it. I love the scene with David and Steven in the car when they're driving to Vegas. And, Steven finds out that he was the butt of the joke his whole life, and the chase up the stairs. Yeah, that episode is totally insane. There's so much going on. And it was such a fun challenge, I think, just because everyone got to be so goofy and so tender. And yeah, I think that episode really exemplifies my favorite parts of the show.
Nat, for you, episode 9, that's where things just got really insane. There's a lot of action. There's also very tender moments amidst that action. When Danny tells Paul, like, hey, I held you back. I threw away your college applications. And just to stop and have that moment and really feel it. I just thought you did an amazing job in that episode. Just like with Laura, I want to hear about your experience cutting that episode, what you put into it, what you took away from it, and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you for all that. Yeah, episode 9 was definitely one that I was always very excited to be working on, and just reading the script, that's the episode. I always kind of thought of it as like the Coen Brothers style, where things just fall apart. Things start to really kind of hit the fan, and all this leading up to all these like decisions and choices that these characters have made, like it all comes to a head and goes wrong in every sort of way that it can. So I think episode 9 was really fun in that sense because it did have a little bit of a departure from like kind of the slower burn stuff going on, where it's just like, okay, now it's go time, and now things are getting pretty heavy duty. So it was very fun to kind of start off with a bang. Danny comes in with Yeun, and the way Jake shot it was very like there was a lot of energy, and I thought that his performance when he's like, hey man, like I'm just gonna go to Mexico, like it was just fun. It was very fun. And then we get into the house, and we have the chase down the hall. We have the Jordan demise, which I really beefed up the sound effects. My assistant and I, Ryan Romback, I just told him, I'm like, let's just make this thing like sound like really gruesome and nasty. And a lot of that was sound design. If you watch that sequence, we did kind of hide the visual aspect of it as much as we could. And a lot of it was based really solely on sound design, which I think was something that I tried to do a lot in Stranger Things days. So yeah, episode 9, I really enjoyed that one, especially like you mentioned that we got to kind of tie it up with Danny and Paul outside, amongst this chaos. And then they have this very like connective moment where Danny's just like, hey man, like get away from me. Like I am not good for you. Like you have to leave. And Paul's performance when he drops his arm and you see that moment of like, man, like you're supposed to be my brother, you're supposed to be looking out for me, but like you hurt me in a way that like is so deep that he decides to leave. And then, and then we get the aftermath where they're driving and we have that kind of slow motion car chase, which was something that I've never done before. And to Bjork, all of it was just very unique storytelling from Sonny and Jake. And I was really happy to be able to kind of put it together for them.
So all of that great work leads up to episode 10, the finale, where instead of all this chaos and all this insanity, it's finally down to just these two people. It's just them injured in the desert, needing one another to survive, and yet hating one another and wishing the other one would die. Laura, you already said the episode starts off with two crows talking to each other through subtitles, which is a pretty wacky departure. As crazy as the series has been up to that point, that's something that's like, well, wait a minute, is this still beef? Let's just start with that. The crows. I mean, did you ever even question that? Like, wait, what are we doing here? Why is this right?
Is this right? Yeah. I definitely was like, what the hell is this show? Because you read episode 9 and even that I'm like, okay, I guess we're going for this. Like it's become an action movie. And then to have episode 10 start with two crows, I feel like for me as a reader, reading the scripts was just like, okay, well, I don't know what's going to happen. So hopefully the audience feels that way too. Like hopefully we've helped them along the ride enough that we could do anything. And so yeah, with the two crows talking to each other, I mean, there are definitely surreal elements throughout the show that were very consciously placed, and George is in his vases, and like we have these sort of like kind of ethereal things here and there sort of sprinkled throughout the show, which is laying breadcrumbs for 10, and so having the two crows talk to each other was just so fun. It's so bizarre to think that, Amy and Danny have had these people following them their whole lives, and now they come together and talk about the horrible things like, oh, she pointed a gun at me and whatnot. It's just so odd, but it was really exciting because it freed us up to do whatever in that episode. So that was very exciting. And the crows, Shadow and Edgar are their names. They're real crows. They're not VFX. And we have a lot of dailies of crows, and it took a long time to put together, but they're very good actors. And that was what I put that together when we were in offices with everyone. And I remember I put that sequence together and kind of shouted down the hall like, "Hey, you guys want to see the crows?" And everyone came in and played it, and it was really fun. I'm very fond of that opening sequence just for that reason. It was it kind of weirdly felt like the whole season was building towards it without knowing it.
The crows were very fun.
Yeah.
There was a moment when Sunny, because at the original crow dialogue was much more verbose. And so we got a note that we were like, can we make this a little more crow-like? And so Sunny and I were sitting in the room, and we were like, okay, like we were like thinking like crows. We're like, I was like, what are they going to say here? And so we came up with like, did he release poo-poo? Like, because he got scared by Amy pointing the gun. He's like, yes, he did release. So there was just like little fun moments where we got, because they were crows, we can kind of say whatever we wanted to say with those subtitles. And that was a fun moment that I remember with Sunny, just kind of like thinking like a crow and being like, how would they speak? How would we make them kind of have this dialogue and get the message across of like what they're thinking, that was really fun.
Yeah.
So the note was, crows seem overeducated. I got it. Well, on that note, I had read that Sunny was still sort of working on the finale pretty late in the process. And that does seem to tie into what you were talking about, Laura, with the way the scripts were rolled out to you. How much change did this episode go through in editorial from the original script? Because it does feel like that there was some flux there still towards the end.
Yeah, it actually went through quite a lot of changes. It was all written, all the scenes were written. I think they were in different order from what I remember. The opening was the same, and kind of everything up until they eat the berries, like until the drug trip starts happening. Once that happened, then it became a question of like, okay, who is feeling the sickness, tracking the sickness? Because we knew, like, there was sort of like a micro timeline within that episode of like, they start to hallucinate and then they're near death. And we have the push in of them on the ground where they're saying goodbye to each other. So we knew where we were starting and where we had to get to. And so tracking how intoxicated they were, because some of those scenes are really tender. Like I love the one where their backs are to each other and they start talking about Paul, and, Danny says, I should have been there for him. But I think that came earlier. That might have come earlier in the script. It went through so many changes. I can't even remember exactly, but at that point it's like, well, they're not high right now. This is really tender. And I want them to feel of sober mind. And the performances were so rich. It didn't make sense wherever it was before. And so we did do a lot of calibrating in between those scenes of having, these beautiful vistas that Larkin shot, and placing shots of nature and sort of rewriting dialogue underneath those shots to help kind of bridge the gap of what are they feeling, who's tripping, who's coming down, is it over, is it building again? And sort of just, designing this path of how the drugs are affecting them. We really did a lot of that in editorial, and, with Sunny, who was, it was his first time directing an episode, and he was very game to try things. And it was wonderful having someone who knew, it was his brainchild and it was the finale. So we spent a lot of time really just going through it all and making sure that it felt authentic, and that we got to that emotional moment where they're laying on the ground staring at each other and speaking as each other. Because that's the other thing. Like we had to do the body swap, which Nat did a lot of work on to help, get the audience into that space with the voices and how the sound mix is happening and the visuals start breathing. So it was really, really the drug trip was a huge part of that episode, and like very, very, very carefully considered in editorial.
That drug trip, what it does is it opens the door for you to get a little creative with sound, with visuals. Now, you were talking about the sound design you did for episode 9. Here, you get to do so much fun stuff with their dialogue and mixing it and swapping it and doing a lot of reverb in the canyon when they're yelling at each other. If you wouldn't mind, just do a little deep dive on the sonic treatments you did in the finale, and you do some crazy stuff with transitions as well.
Yes, well, definitely getting into when they're tripping proper, when they come down the tree, that was very we very much wanted to have a very subtle feel. We didn't want to like hit you too hard over the head with like, oh, they're tripping. So we added a nice wave effect, and we rotoed out the character so it wasn't affecting their faces. It was just affecting the backgrounds. And we kind of like, we would pinpoint, be like, we want this little bush to wiggle a little more. So there was a lot of of interesting kind of choices that Sunny and I were making, where how much of that wavy motion was happening. Because again, we didn't want it to be cheesy in a way where it was like, so like, hey, look, everybody, they're tripping. Yay. It was more like they're tripping for sure. There's something kind of off-putting and a little bit strange happening. And then as far as like the dialogue goes, we had, it was scripted that there would be a body switch moment, but then ultimately Sunny and I were just like, let's just have them record the entire other characters' lines so that we have that flexibility when it comes to mixing, where we can pick and choose whose voice is coming through in different reads that they're coming through. So that ultimately kind of covered our bases, where we can open up, like you mentioned, we can open up and have all sorts of possibilities of like, is Danny talking? Is Amy talking? Like, who, we can blend them in and out. And so I think that was a really good choice on Sunny's part to have that kind of that option there. And then Laura could speak more about the big canyon. I love that scene so much. It opens up with the big giant fart across the canyon, which is like, I still don't know why Sunny chose to do that, but I love that he did. It was so funny to me. Fart jokes never get old to me. I don't know why.
I know why, Nat.
It's just, they're funny. Come on. And just, I love it that they're yelling and like they have this, Danny's, use nice words. There's just so many funny classic moments, and it's such a good, interesting choice that Sunny did to have them so small in frame, just like yelling. It was such a cool scene, and I loved what Laura did there. But besides that, sonically, like there was just a lot of different. We used a lot of like kind of flashbacks audio wise throughout episode 10. So we used audio as a tool to tell the story for sure in episode 10 quite a bit.
Laura, you mentioned the push into the ground. You were seeing that shot or a version of that shot, not knowing what it was, in previous episodes. So there's that element. And also you're hearing sort of in the background, those little quotes that you play out.
Well, I'm really glad you asked about that shot of the ground, because that was not scripted in the previous episodes. That was something that Nat and Jake found. And I think it was in episode 7 where you guys put that in. And then just, because we have this sort of like void, we call it the void that is within Amy and Danny. And like, how do you visually represent that? And so Nat and Jake had this great idea of putting it in episode 7, like the push in on Danny when he's at the church, and, everything looks right, but we have to convey something is still missing. And so it's sort of this abstract shot of the ground, and we don't know what it is yet. And because they did that, and this was one of the benefits of being in the office, I think Sunny had been in their room, and then Sunny came in mine and was like, hey, they're doing this thing. I think that could help us with this one Amy moment that we can't, like, that we're having trouble with. And so then we were able to incorporate it into one of our previous episodes. And, that's the benefit of having like a very collaborative team in person, and we're all in communication. So it helps build cohesion. So then by the time you get to episode 10, you understand that that's what that was. And I think that was really smart and something that, everybody came up with in the room. But Nat, I'm going to let Nat take the sonic question, because he did a lot of he kind of carried the episode through to the end.
Yes, you hear snippets of conversations that you hear Paul say like, hey, they never got my college applications. You hear the parents, Danny's parents, talking to him. So I think those are just kind of audio memories that are kind of coming through in this tripped out stage, where you're actually getting a little bit more information about like Paul being like, what happened? Like, they never got my college applications. And I think that kind of informs where the characters have gotten to this point where Danny's thinking about these choices that he made and how they affected these people. And so those definitely were in the desert, which I thought was cool. It just added that kind of element of, you're out in the desert tripping, and you're having these memories and moments that are kind of surreal and ethereal. And that was definitely we added a lot of EQ in there, and then the sound team took it home and did their work on it.
Mm-hmm.
So in that final episode, you come full circle by going back to that incident where they bump into each other in the parking lot. But this time you see Amy sit and think before she flips off Danny. You see Danny just sort of think a little bit about what's happening as opposed to just the very quick acts of engaging with each other. Tell me about going back and doing that part. And was that all shot on the day back then? Or is that something where they had to go back and shoot specific separate scenes of them delivering those performances?
That scene in particular wasn't that way originally. So we had cut the scene and it ended that way with Amy in the hospital, which I thought was great. And then we got a note from Netflix that they wanted a little more to elevate us to punch out the season. And Sonny and I, this was at the very end. So you asked like how long did the writing and the shooting and everything go? It went right up to the very end, and it was because of this scene. And so we were thinking about it, and I was like, you know what? I think I know what they're wanting here, and I think what they're wanting is a little bit of a recall back to some earlier moments. And there was a debate with Sonny because I know that there's kind of we didn't necessarily want to do a flashback. Was a flashback like the story? Was it the type of storytelling that we're using in Beef? So we tried it anyways. And what we did is audio wise, I took some clips of them hearing the horn come in and then cutting back to that scene of them in the parking lot. But we didn't have the shot of Amy thinking about it before she did her finger. So it was constructed because that's all we had. I'm like, let's just try this and see if it works. And once we saw it in action, we're like, actually, that's kind of cool. And then Sonny had the brilliant idea of going back and getting Amy for one more shot. That was it, one more shot. And we went out and we got it like in the last week. And we went out on a very small budget, and I wasn't there, but they shot Amy in the car, and they got a bunch of different ways that she could be reacting. And I thought it was so good that it slotted right in, brought us back to the beginning of the show, and then it tied it together nicely. Also, her performance when we come out of the flashback, where it looks like she's thinking about it, worked very well, where we were able to kind of tell that story of like the beginning and the end and like where we started and where we ended up.
How did you collaborate on that episode? I mean, was there any rhyme or reason to what each of you worked on? And did you work on everything together? How did that play out?
I mean, Nat and I were in constant communication throughout the show. We were really very involved in watching early cuts of each other's episodes and that sort of thing. And so with episode 10, kind of like I said, it ended up being an episode that fell into my slot, just the way the episodes were divided with the schedule. But I had to leave to go to another show. And so I knew that Nat was going to be taking it over. We discussed it and he was fine with it. And I was very grateful. And I knew it would be in really good hands. And so I did my best to keep him involved with everything along the way and bring him in. And I'm sure you came in on Zooms with Sonny and I, and we pitched ideas. So it felt very collaborative throughout the process, which was wonderful because kind of what I was saying, like we moved so many things around early on. It was nice to have Nat involved in just tracking like, okay, here's how we got here and here's why these things are happening the way that they are. And then Nat took it over and just elevated it and like did some wonderful things with that final shootout with George, like when George comes. So when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, you've solved a lot of problems that I couldn't figure out. So it was so grateful to have his eyes and his talents on it.
Yeah, I think to echo all of that, it's I think our show, we had a core group of editors. It was Laura, myself, Jordan Kim, and Harry Yeun, and we all collaborated together. And so I think working on episode 10 for me was kind of like, again, just Laura was going off to another show, and so we all had a shared responsibility of like making sure that the show got to the finish line. And so I was happy to take over and kind of take episode 10 to the finish line. And it was left in such a great place that Laura had gotten it. And then Sonny and I just worked and did some things, like I said, with the Crow. And then we did some things with George. So there was a lot of tweaking and changes that happened after the fact, but it was always there. And it was just kind of getting it from this place that it was up into to what you saw in the final picture. And that happened with many of our episodes. In episode 5, Jordan and I collaborated heavily. Episode 8, Jordan and Laura collaborated heavily. Episode 1 was Laura and Harry. So I would just say that it's just emblematic of our team effort across all of the editors and our assistants, Ryan and Lily and Josh, and even, our PA who became our coordinator, Leah Henry. Just everyone was just on board to make this thing as good as it can be. So I think, just working on 10 was just part of the process. And I'm glad we were all, I think we all have our name stamped on it.
Definitely.
Well, before I let you go, and maybe I'm only thinking of this because it's lunchtime where Nat and I are, Danny especially, but I think Danny and Amy, they're stress eaters. Like when things are not going well, Danny will crush a Whopper. So whether it's stress eating or anything else, when you're stressed in editorial, what are the things that you find that you do to try and relieve that tension, relieve that stress?
I go into my assistant's room and I bitch, and then I take a walk. So yeah, Lily Wild, my assistant on this one, and she was definitely a therapist, and I had my dog in office with us a lot, and so taking him on walks, and honestly, I'm kind of joking, but seriously, taking a walk and getting away from my desk for a second, it's usually when I'm like butt up against a problem that I can't solve. If I can get away from my desk for a second, sometimes I'll have epiphanies, or I'll come back and see it a little clearer. So that's very important to me. And having an incredible supportive staff of talented people is very, very helpful.
Well, for all you aspiring editors out there, you not only have to know how to organize bins, you got to be a shrink for the editor too. So keep that in mind.
It helps.
It's true. It's true.
I don't know what you're talking about. There's no stress ever.
Yeah, what stress? What could be stressful about editing a big movie or TV show? Probably a lot of things, but I am sure Nat and Laura faced it with grace and poise and maybe a primal scream or two. However they did it, the result was a really fun and fascinating series, not to mention an Emmy nomination. A big thank you and best of luck to Nat Fuller and Laura Zempel. It is true that there's no secret recipe for getting an Oscar or Emmy or any kind of award recognition, but the hard data will prove to you that an overwhelming number of artists who are nominated for such awards used Media Composer on their projects. So take that for what you will. I'm just saying. And they don't use some secret Hollywood edition of Media Composer that costs thousands of dollars. They may invoice the studio for that, but between you and me, it is the exact same highly affordable app that awaits you on avid.com right now. So hit that link in the show notes and get cracking on the first of what I'm sure will be many of your award-winning projects. Well, that will do it for today. I appreciate you spending your limited free time on the podcast, and maybe you'll spend a little more time on it again. I hope so. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury, thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.